which I titled Theological Anthropology, How Like an Angel, How Like a God, from the Shakespeare quote I started with. I'm gonna have fewer things to say in terms of slides and leave more time for general discussion of this piece as well as the whole day, because I will try with this piece to bring it together, but to focus on the theological aspects. And I use the term theological anthropology. I use it in a kind of general way, but it has a very specific reference point in theology. And I want to start with that reference point because that reference point then opens up what we're going to do in terms of theological anthropology. And the reference point is Karl Rahner, the amazing Jesuit theologian of the 20th century, one of the greatest theologians, I think, of all time, who actually started thinking about theological anthropology by saying that theological anthropology starts with an examination of the human condition. This was his framework. And this approach to theology was very different when Rahner started doing this in the early parts of the 20th century, because theological reflection at that point, up to that point, started with God. Obviously, theology means a study of God. It's asking questions about God in some sense. So Rahner wanted to start with the human condition. And he said to be human is to have a latent awareness of God. And in parentheses, the infinite. And here's the logic of his position. He says that to have awareness of limits, the finite, entails openness to the infinite. As Brother Brian was saying earlier about the body, the limits that we are aware of, you can't be aware that something is a limit unless you have an openness to something that doesn't have a limit. It's kind of a logic Rahner was using. Okay, then he said, openness to the infinite, openness to that, he equated with transcendence. So when we say that God is both immanent and transcendent, we're talking about this transcendent notion beyond the reality that we're aware of, the limits that we're aware of. And then he said that therefore no proof of God is really required, since this transcendence is part and parcel of being human. So his argument theologically was, we don't need to prove that God exists, it's part of who we are. In some sense, however you want to define God. Now, in the break, Casey and I were talking about what this means when we say the word God. And I'm not really going to get into that part of this, but let me, in great detail, but I want to start with a word or two about what we mean by the word God, because it's much misunderstood in modern parlance, okay? For instance, Richard Dawkins wrote The God Delusion. I don't know how many of you read the book. Did you read it? Okay. I was like Brother Brian. I shook my head. I know Richard as an evolutionary biologist. I don't want to read this book. Okay, so Ted Peters, who I'll talk about a little bit later, a colleague of mine, we were invited to go to Appleton, Wisconsin, to Lawrence University to give a couple of talks on our specialties, and we got a message from the Student Association that said, we want you to comment on The God Delusion by Dawkins. We want to have a discussion with you about that book. And so we had 2 months before the meeting, so we said, okay, we'll read it. So I bought the book, and I sat down to read it, and my wife was in the other room, and I was screaming. I was just, no, you didn't say that. Oh my God, you didn't say that. So I was getting so angry that she came in and she said, what is going on? I can't work. I said, well, this book is driving me crazy. Richard knows nothing here. She said, okay, here's what I want you to do. Close the book, calm down. She said, now I want you to open it and read it as though you were reading a graduate student's dissertation. So I got my red pencil out. I started reading and underlining and writing comments in the margin, and I got through it that way. The problem with Richard's book is that his definition of the word God is very different from any modern theologian's definition of the word God. Okay? His book is written about a God that actually very few of us, if any of us, hold as what God means. A very fundamentalist kind of approach to God that he grew up with probably in South Africa. I don't know his history except that that's where he grew up. And his theological education kind of stopped in grammar school. And that's what he's flailing against, okay, is that notion. And as I point out to Casey, Aquinas does it perfectly in the Summa. The first paragraph of the first book of the Summa, Thomas starts by saying, by definition, you can't know what God is. You can't know what God is. You can't come to God by knowledge, because God is beyond anything you can know. Okay? By definition, it's called apophatic theology when you do that. Then Thomas says, but God gave us this brain and this intellect and this soul and all these parts with which we can get knowledge. And so what we can do is know something about what God must be like by an appreciation of what God does, by observing God's actions. And he said, therefore we can come to knowledge of God by analogy. Only by analogy. So just as my favorite example is when we say King of Kings, we mean think of any king that you can think of, and God is like the king of all those kings. That's an analogy. God isn't the King of Kings, but that's a good analogy for what God must be like, okay? So when I say God here, I'm thinking of that apophatic God of Thomas. I can't know what that God is. This is not the God of the Old Testament or the New Testament. Not the fundamentalist God, it's not the Catholic God. This is God in that larger apophatic sense. Okay? So we're all on the same theological page. Okay? Now, having said that, let's talk a little bit more about the theological approach. So we started off by saying Imago Dei, that we said that sort of in the Western tradition, this statement in Genesis, let us make man in our image, resulted in this concept of Imago Dei, that is, that we are created somehow in the image of God. And what Rahner is referencing, I think, in that is this Imago Dei. When he says we have a latent awareness of the infinite, I think Rahner is saying the property of a human soul is the human person's awareness of God. This is a property of the human soul. In the human person in Thomas's sense, the complete human person where the soul is the formal cause of what it is to be human. I think that's what Rahner means by his awareness of the infinite, is what the church has always thought of as Imago Dei. Now, having said that, that's just to sort of tie that into that concept of Imago Dei, made in the image of God. We need to talk a little bit more about what that might mean for us as humans. And one of the first ones I want to talk about is this issue of the immortality of the soul. Because Aristotle thought that the human soul, the rational soul, subsists after death. Yes, he did. Some philosophers don't want to agree with that, but he did. Now, he thought that it existed in a very special way. He, like Thomas, would say that the soul, absent the body, cannot be human. Because to be human is to be body and soul, by definition. Okay? So whatever it is that subsists after death, which Aristotle called the agent intellect, okay, freely translated from the Greek, exists in the intellectual fashion, but not in the human fashion. Aristotle said it does not remember. So for Aristotle, the soul is immortal. He said perpetual, but not in the sense that it existed forever. An individual human soul began at some point, but then exists forever after that. But only in this intellectual passive or impassive functionality of it. It does not remember, in his view. So Thomas took off on that. But then he wanted to add his Christian perspective to it. So philosophically, in the Treatise on Human Nature, he agrees with Aristotle and says the human soul is immortal in this sense. Okay, it's incorporeal, which he established separately, and then said, and it is also immortal. Its intellectual capacity continues. And his argument for that is, along with Aristotle's, that something that something that is incorporeal cannot cease to exist. And there are several, I'm not going into the depth of the philosophy that got Aristotle and Thomas there, but there's an argument there. But Thomas then takes it on from a Christian perspective and says that given the doctrine of the resurrection of the body, and this is found in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, he says, it doesn't make sense to me, even philosophically, that something which exists as human, body and soul, and then after the body dies, exists as this intellectual capacity, could remain fulfilled without being body and soul again. So in 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, if we don't believe in the resurrection, then we are basically without hope. If the resurrection isn't why we're doing this, we're without hope as Christians. Then Thomas says, given that, I'm going to say there's a final resurrection of the body, and whatever it is that is the intellectual agent will be rejoined with body, and all will be well in the end. But that, he argues, is a statement of his religious faith, not a philosophical conclusion. Okay, he's not trying to make a philosophical piece out of that, merely a theological reflection. So I want to be real clear about Thomas as philosopher versus Thomas as theologian in that piece. Okay, but that's what gives him his hope as a Christian theologian and philosopher for something to take with him beyond the kind of barren view that he felt Aristotle had of immortality of the intellect only. But nonetheless, they both have reasons for believing the soul continues after death. Now, what is it about that immortal, incorporeal soul that now makes us human in a theological sense, in Rahner's sense, of this awareness of the infinite? And one thing, of course, is relationship. We are social creatures. Now, we talked earlier about us becoming societies, hunter-gatherer societies, and working in cooperation, and this led to the evolution of language and symbol use and all that. But by the end of that process, as we look at ourselves now and reflect on it, we are social creatures. So, in some sense, to be human is to be known through this relationship kind of functionality. We know each other by we know who we are by relationship. Either within our families or within our larger communities, or even in dialogue like we're doing now. This I-thou interchange that is subjective, that where my theory of mind and your theory of mind are meeting in concourse, and I'm inferring your mental state and you're inferring mine, is the relationship I'm talking about. Right? And that relationship, the theologian in Thomas would say, is reflected in the relationship with God. Okay. I was talking at lunchtime about a book, and I still can't find in my memory base the name of this book. There's a wonderful woman who is a Dominican sister in North Carolina who is a charismatic writer, but she's trained as a chemist. And she has this great book in which she uses the relationship of the Trinity to talk about scientific relationships in the natural world. And it's just spectacular. It's all about relationship. And even in biology, she talks about personal relationship. Again, in this Trinitarian reflection, if you like reading that kind of thing. So one thing about humanness is relationship. We exist in relationship. To be human is to love and be loved, I would argue. And C.S. Lewis, in his great essay, The Four Loves, talks about the four kinds of love that we experience. Of course, there's agape, the self-giving love that is part of the Eucharistic banquet that we talk about. Then there's storge, the love in a family, the love within a family is another level, Lewis said. Philia, the love between brotherly love or between friends, that level of love. And finally, eros, the passion, sexual love that we experience. And my argument is that to be human is to embrace all four of those. Okay, that's who we are. We live in relationship, and we live in loving relationships of a variety of kinds, even with our God. Okay. Then to be human is to be a moral agent, to make choices. We make conscious choices. We are creatures who make conscious choices. Now, this is much debated. There's been some recent work reported in Science about a variety of psychological experiments dealing with free will, okay? And whether or not free in free will is actually free, or whether choices are dictated by circumstances, internal chemistry, all the things that we're talking about in terms of brain. I'm going to say a little bit about that in a minute. But nonetheless, whether they're dictated by the chemistry or however you want to look at it, willful acts are often rational acts, okay? Therefore, willful acts are performed by rational beings, which is who we are, okay? So I would say that when I choose to do something, it's very different than when my dog chooses to do something, okay? I don't think she chooses to go out and roll in the mud just to get me upset. I think she chooses to go out and roll in the mud because at that time she's outside that mud she needs to roll in to cool off, or whatever was driving the need for her to roll in the mud. Because when she comes back wagging her tail completely covered in mud and I've got to hose her down, which she hates, she absolutely loathes being hosed. She's a Labrador, she swims, but she doesn't like being hosed. You know, it's not like she did that to aggravate me, and especially she didn't do it to get hosed, right? Because she doesn't like that. It's not a willful act on her, in her case. It's a reaction to something. If I went out and rolled in the mud, it would be a willful act, okay? So it would be a choice I would make, because I'm a rational being and Molly is not. Now, the question of free will, this issue of free will, to me, is very interesting, especially in this modern discussion about it, what brain chemistry is involved and what psychological experiment of who demonstrates whether it's free or not. The word free will actually is something Thomas wouldn't have used. Okay? And Eleanor Stump, shown here, a wonderful Thomistic theologian, Thomistic scholar, philosopher, and she describes Aquinas' take on free will as follows. She says that we have reason, we have rationality, that's a function of our soul, of our intellect, okay? We have a will, which is our drive to act, okay? He distinguishes that from what people call free will. Will is our drive to act. And then, out of this interplay between our drive to act and our rationality emerges what people now call free will, okay? So, humans are moral agents because our rationality says one thing and our drive to act says something here, and the interplay between them, which depends on our sensuality, on our sensitiveness, on our appetites, as Thomas would have called them, results in an action, right? So, for instance, the will that we have and the rationality don't always lead us to act in an appropriate way, because our appetite might convince and overwhelm our reason about whether we should or shouldn't do something. I have a friend that used to always tell me when we were in arguments, don't let your emotion override your logic. And that's what can happen to us. So when emotion overrides reason, will to act goes in a direction that you might not necessarily approve of when you were back in the more rational state to think about it, right? So this doesn't guarantee correct action. But in Aquinas' view, what we call free will is an interplay between three things: rational thinking, the will to act, and our appetite. And when those three interact properly, then we get proper behavior. Okay? So the measurements that people are doing that are called free will and trying to key it to brain chemistry are looking at like one piece of that very complex interaction between the intellect, the drive to act, which might be chemical, like my dog's willingness to roll in the mud, and the appetite, the sort of emotional piece. Okay, and so if they only dissect out one piece, again, it's reduction to just the parts rather than the conglomerate whole. So we are beings in relationship, we are beings who love, and we are moral agents. Those are all sort of theological positions about who we are as people. And I call them theological because in some sense they relate to Rahner's idea that we have this latent awareness of the infinite. When I choose to act, I have a latent awareness of, I know what the consequences of my actions will be. I'm beyond the limit of the action itself, unlike my dog. Okay. When I choose to love, I love in that larger sense, or I can choose to love in that larger sense. Okay. I can form relationships that extend over generations, and I have awareness of beyond the limits of what seem to be going on right here. Okay, so they all are in the sense of Rahner's transcendent piece that makes us the focus of his theological anthropology, and that's why I put them together in these pieces. Now, interesting is how for me, and I was reflecting on this with Casey, is how I got thinking about all this. And I started you off with my piece about Benedict Ashley and the cat, and that's how I got on this. But this piece was not part of that. This idea of thinking about soul wasn't really, that was really about why is biology reductionist, and why did I say that crazy thing, and what did he mean when he said the cat's dead, all that stuff. How do I think about what it means to be human? And Ted Peters, who I'm going to introduce you to in a minute, is a colleague of mine from Graduate Theological Union, and he and I have worked for a number of years writing books about the issue of the controversy, presumed controversy, between biological evolution and theology. And we've done this for years, and we came and did one for Brother Brian here at the Summer Spirituality Institute. All over the world we've done this, and it sort of culminated in the year of Darwin, the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth and 150th of the publication. Ted and I must have done 5 each separate talks around the world on this subject. And we said, okay, enough. Let's do something different. Now, just for our own intellectual attraction, as Brother Brian would say, we need something more attractive. At the same time, a colleague at University of Arizona was retiring, who was the head of the astrobiology program there. We had started this while I was in the biology department, and it was a big program that involved planetary science and astronomy and biology, and it was all exploration of off-planet life. That was the issue, right? And so he's retiring, so a lot of us were invited back to give sort of a festschrift, a series of papers for his retirement. And I chose to talk about the philosophical position of thinking of extraterrestrial life. What has that historically been philosophically, right? And I kind of came to the question in my own mind of, if we met an extraterrestrial, how would we know they weren't like us? And in order to know that, we'd need to know who we are. So that's what led me to the question, right? And so I thought, well, I need to recapture soul in this discussion and sort of do that. So that led me off on this track. Meanwhile, Ted, using the same impetus, kind of went in a different direction. Ted said, what happens when we meet an extraterrestrial intelligence, or ETI? Is that the ultimate challenge to theology? Would that challenge us theologically, to our anthropology, right? Well, in typical Ted fashion, he wanted to know what happens when we meet ETI. This is a great take on Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. La creazione di E.T. Love it. Here's Ted. Ted is a professor of systematic theology at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, which is part of the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. And he wrote a paper that just got published this past February in the Philosophical Transactions called The Implications of the Discovery of Extraterrestrial Life for Religion. Okay? So the challenge to our anthropology. And in classic Ted fashion, he carried out something called the Peters ETI Religious Crisis Survey. This is, if you know Ted, this would be so Ted. What he did is he went online and he organized a survey where he asked people different questions about what knowing that there's an extraterrestrial intelligence would do to their religious belief. And on the top one, he asked official confirmation of the discovery of a civilization of intelligent beings living on another planet would so undercut my beliefs that my beliefs would face a crisis. And then you have agree, neither agree nor disagree, or disagree strongly. And you'll notice where all the bars are. Disagree strongly for literally every religious persuasion. Catholics, Protestant, evangelicals, Protestant, mainline, Orthodox, Mormon, Jewish, Buddhist, everybody he could get in the survey, right? Even more interesting is this question 5, where he said, even though my religious or non-religious viewpoint would remain unaffected, contact with extraterrestrials would so undercut traditional beliefs that the world's religion would face a crisis. What's interesting is that religious people, by and large, disagree with that. The people who agree with that are the non-religious people. And because it turns out it's the common assumption among scientists who work in this field that when ETI is in front of us, religion's out the window. It'll throw religion out. So Ted was curious about that. He really wondered, why is that so? When religious people don't think that at all. Okay? Religious people are not worried about that, apparently. And he's talking to theologians about this. So Ted begins to think about the models of ET that we use to think about. And there are 2, really, models that he gives us. One is called the alien enemy model. And that's the model where the aliens are bent on conquest and destruction, like War of the Worlds, Independence Day, even the new series on television now, Falling Sky. The aliens are bent on coming here and destroying us and taking over our planet, the alien enemy. And this is the model that's used most, it turns out, in science fiction, like movies. The other model is called the celestial savior model, okay? Like the original Day the World Stood Still with Klaatu, E.T., the extraterrestrial, and Close Encounters. This is where these are benign people that we meet. In fact, they're saviors. They will come, and they're an advanced civilization, and they will have progressed way past all our faults, and they will show us the solution to all our problems. Energy crisis will be over. All health care will be free and available because it will be so easy. You name it. Every problem we have will be solved when we meet our celestial saviors. Okay? Now, the 2 models are used by 2 very different groups. The alien enemy model is the one we find in sci-fi books. And not all of them, but a lot of movies, like the ones I mentioned. But the celestial savior model is many, but not all, in the astrobiology community, especially the SETI community, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. They very much have in mind a celestial savior model. Now, there have been some criticisms of it. Stephen Hawking came out recently and said, listen, they're going to have the same problems we have, and there's no guarantee that they're going to be benign, so let's be cautious here about sending signals out and all that. But he's one of the few critics. Most in the astrobiology community, when you're around, especially the SETI people who I've met with, are all about, we got to keep up the search because we can solve all our problems once we find these guys, because they're going to be the celestial savior. In fact, the SETI project was launched by this man, Frank Drake, in 1961, who wrote down this equation, which is called the Drake equation, which supposedly computes the probability of the inevitability of life. And each of the factors in the equation is a different number that is a fraction of something. For instance, the F sub p is the fraction of planets, fraction of stars that have planets. F sub L is the fraction of the ones that go on to develop life. But most interesting is that one, FL. The fraction of planets who are around stars that could support life that go on to find life. In the original equation, Frank gave that factor a value of 1. In other words, anytime there's a planet that could develop life, it will develop life. Now, he based that on a sample size of 1, our planet. So you can see the kind of almost religious fervor that's embedded in this search, right? And the thing that drives it is the idea that we will find these aliens. And the logic here is, if they have evolved to the point where they can communicate with us and fly to visit us from light years away, they are way beyond our technology. And it's a belief in progress. If they're way beyond our technology, they are way beyond us morally, way beyond us in every way we can think of. And therefore, they will be these benign people who will save us. Okay, that's the astrobiology community's take. And Ted and I encountered this at the meetings that we started going to in astrobiology, especially the SETI-sponsored meetings that I've been to. Okay, so back to Ted. Ted said, okay, let me pose a series of theological, anthropological questions for this case. And he chose 4 issues. One issue is the scope of creation. Would the evidence of life on another planet destroy your theological view of God's creation? And most theologians say no. God created the whole universe, so anybody that's out there is part of God's creation. End of story. That's not a biggie. The moral character issue comes to whether they're going to be the alien enemy or the celestial savior, and I've kind of told you about that. Multiple incarnations is a good one for Christians, because that question asks the theologians, did Christ have to be incarnated multiple times to save every sentient being in the universe, or once, only here? Or did some not fall and remain free from a need of salvation, and others did, so they were still, all those questions of sort of specifically Christian nature he asked of a bunch of theologians, and God answers, which you can read in the paper. But the one I'm interested in for our purposes is the human dignity question he asked. And in that question he said to a group of theologians he surveyed, will contact with more advanced extraterrestrial intelligence diminish human dignity? He assumed the benign model, the celestial savior, and he said, what does encounter with these celestial saviors do with our concept of who we are, especially about Imago Dei? If we think we're made in the image of God, and in walks this guy who's got all the answers and is way beyond us, am I no longer the image of God? Is he or she? What does this do to the dignity question, right? And he got some interesting answers on this one. There were 2 people he quotes in the paper, Paul Davies, who's an astrophysicist at Arizona State, and David Wilkinson, who's a physicist and theologian at Cambridge. Now, Paul is actually very sympathetic to the science-religion dialogue. He's written many wonderful books about this, but he himself is not he's not a religious person. He's not embedded in a particular religious practice right now. He's more in the general spiritual realm issue. And he says terrestrial religions will have to change in this regard. Human uniqueness will be in question. Okay? David Wilkinson, on the other hand, who is a theologian in a particular, he's an Anglican theologian, says Imago Dei is not exclusive to us. If they are out there and they are ETIs, they are Imago Dei also. And the difference between the 2 answers, if you think about it, Ted says, is that Paul Davies assumes that religions are evolutionary products of our existence, that they come out of our adaptive need to do things as a community, that standard evolutionary explanation for religions, whereas Wilkinson sees religions as products of revelation, of that experience with the infinite that Ronner talks about. So they come at religion from different perspectives, and therefore their answers are very different about what ETI would do. But the reason I raise this, and I'll end with this next one and we'll talk for a while, is because I think this helps us build a composite picture of who we are when we start thinking about ETI. So who are we? We're rational language-using animals. We've seen that. We're social, relational creatures. Okay, we exist in relation to each other. We think of ourselves as Imago Dei. Another way of saying that is created co-creator. That's a term used by some theologians. Created co-creator. We are creative in collaboration with our Creator. We have an awareness beyond our limits, as Rahner would say. We are aware of the infinite. We are moral agents who make choices. Okay? Now, all of this can be put together in what is our message to the universe. Here's that plaque that was sent out on Pioneer that was designed by Carl Sagan, Frank Drake, a variety of others. It's etched into a gold plate. It was tacked on to the second Pioneer spacecraft that was launched beyond our solar system. And the idea here is that somewhere in time and in space, an alien, an extraterrestrial intelligence will encounter this spacecraft, and on this plaque will be a statement about who we are. And everything I've just described about us is on this plaque. Rationality. It's got the distance between the atoms of a hydrogen atom. It shows a quasar source. It has our location relative to our sun. It's got lots of scientific knowledge embedded in it that we arrived at by rational observation of the world. It's social and relational. There are two people there, male and female. We're a community. We are Imago Dei in some sense. I don't know if that's embedded in there, but awareness beyond limits. Clearly, we sent this out of our solar system with the belief that someday, somehow, someone will encounter it, way beyond the lifetime of Frank Drake or Carl Sagan or anybody else involved in the project. And we're moral agents who make choices. Notice the male is got his hand up, which is supposed to reflect that we are peaceful people. Okay, not warlike. We're supposed to be showing that we are peaceful, and therefore they could come and see us and not have to worry about being killed. So this is our message to the universe, apparently, about who we are. And it embeds, I think, in it everything we've been talking about today about what it means to be human. So let's, with that, start to chat a little bit about this. Thank you.
Although you probably started at the very beginning that most of your presentation would be based on Western religions and philosophy.
Yes.
You probably know about Eastern philosophy and religions, and do they come to the same conclusion about who humans are, which is similar to you have exposed here? Or is different? Do overlap some of the things?
So I assume you got that, Casey, yes. So I think we can say that essentially all religious perspectives in the world have some take on the nature of reality being more than material. Okay? Almost every religion has a concept of soul of some kind that is incorporeal. Okay? That is part of what it means to be human. Okay? But if we back off from that just kind of very naive general statement and talk more about specifics of religions, especially non-Western ones, or I'm going to say better, non-Abrahamic, that would be a better way of phrasing it, because even though I've talked about the Western tradition, I'm really coming out of an Abrahamic tradition, which includes Judaism and Islam. In both the intellectual and theological sense. I mean, in all ways, this is true. So if we get into more Eastern philosophies and Asian religions, I was asked this question at lunch. I don't really know a lot about that, other than the encounters I've had with scholars in that field in meetings that I've gone to. Okay? So I've not done those studies myself. I'd have to quote them. So then it differs. Okay, so for instance, Buddhism is not really that concerned about the science theology issue or the dualist issue. They don't have that as a concern. And so when we go to meetings and we're talking all about, well, you're a dualist, you're a monist, the Buddhists are looking at it, it's like, no, you're all human. Can we go now? You know? So, I mean, it doesn't seem to be at issue. Certainly I know from my work with Native American scholars that Indians don't worry about this. They're not dualists. They never have been, right? They have a very holistic view in their cosmologies. We've done some work with people, and not me personally, but Ted and others, and I've been to meetings about this, Korean scholars, Japanese scholars embedded in their religious traditions. Again, each has a different issue to take away. The real big conflicts between Western science and religion come with the religions that are in the West, to be honest. With Christianity in the main, Judaism, is kind of, we don't worry about it. We see the issue, but, we got another thing to worry about, the Holocaust. We don't need to worry about this stuff. Seriously, that's the take I get from Judaic scholars is we're not dealing with this. We got bigger fish to fry still, okay? And the Muslim scholars are like, well, we invented this, come on, Avicenna, that was us. But then they went into a very conservative mode, and now they're trying to come back out of that. So they have a very kind of fundamentalist view of science and religion, in which they say, basically everything that you're telling me about science is basically written in the Quran. That's the fundamentalist Islamic perspective. And there are a lot of Islamic scientists and scholars, philosophers, who are trying to counter that in the Muslim world. And those are the things I'm hearing at these meetings that I go to, those particular perspectives. But I'm not a scholar in those myself, so it's hard for me to say that I've been fair in representing them. I don't know if that helps. Yes. Yes, Cheryl.
Okay. I wanted to go back to the issue of free will. And, I heard you break that down into three components. There's rationality, the drive to act, and then sort of sensual appetites, yes, if I got that right. But when I think of what I think of as free will, it has to do with control and who is or what is the mechanism by which I decide. Well, the drive to act, maybe that has some determination about whether I do something or not. And then when I'm exercising either my rationality or making a decision based on an appetite, am I in control of that decision, or am I somehow, I believe I am, I feel like I am, but there's that doubt about, or am I somehow pre-programmed? Am I as a human entity, person, in control of that decision? And I believe that if I am, that's free will. That's the free in the free will. And, I was interested to hear if you had something to say about what is that mechanism?
Well, again, a lot of the psychological studies that have been done sort of aim at sort of teasing out how free is free will. How much are you driven to act that's out of your control, okay? And how much is in your control? And most of when I'm reading books, there's a great series of essays just published about what it means, what the human self is. And a lot of them are these behavioral essays that are done about psychological experiments designed to tease that piece out, right? And so it depends on what you measure. Clearly, we are animals. And those three arms of that triangle that Aquinas describes can act in different ways independently. So if I have to breathe, and you have a pillow over my face, and I can't breathe, I will fight. That's one of my strongest appetites, is for breath. And I will fight without thinking. I might, destroy you trying to breathe, which afterwards I would reflect on and go, oh my God, I killed somebody. That would be horrible. But that appetite would be so strong, there would be no rational decision. Do I really want to breathe? Let me think about it. Should I do that or not? No, I would try to breathe, okay? So we have some urges, some of those appetites we're talking about that are so powerful that they're not going to involve a rational kind of decision. And Thomas would say that's when just the appetite portion of us is behaving, right? When he really talks about what we call free will, he's talking about those things we choose to do when all three are interacting, okay? So not just when I'm reading a book and exercising my intellect, let's say, but when I now have to choose to do something. I think I'm going to go rob a bank today. let's see, the bank is down on Paseo del Pueblo Sur. I can go in the closet and get this gun out. I know where the bullets are, and I really need about $10,000 to cover expenses, and I bet I can go into that bank today and get that much from the teller if I take this gun and go in there. So I think I'll do that. Now, I've made a rational set of choices to do something. Okay, my intellect has figured out how to do it. I have a drive to act that takes me over to get the gun and get in the car and drive down there. And somehow my appetite has figured out a way to tell my reason that this would be a good thing because we need $10,000 because, you know, there's that new motorcycle I want. So let's go get it. Now, all of that, Thomas would say, would be a free choice of action. Okay, where I've chosen to do something. I'm not being forced to do it. I'm in control of it. Even though in the end, when the Taos police find me, I'm going to jail. Okay? So, I mean, it's a choice I've made that is I'm in control of. Now, some might argue you're driven by your circumstances of your life. Okay. I got that I'm set up in a life that might not have given me enough ethical information about whether what I'm doing is right or wrong. Okay, maybe I've got that as part of the background, but I don't think that's what's making me rob the bank or not rob the bank, okay? Now, I'm in disagreement now with social psychologists who do these experiments, like the classic experiments of Stanley Milgram that he was famous for, the experiments where somebody was challenged to rather give an electric shock or not give an electric shock to a person in these groups, depending on the rewards that were going to come out. And he had this whole panoply of studies about that that are being still replicated now in a variety of ways. That tend to argue people will do horrible things to other people in the right circumstances, and it's beyond their control. So there is that set of things out there that say that, but then there are another set that argue, no, we're in control. We make these decisions. Okay, I mean, absent these experimental conditions, I'm saying, we make these decisions, and they're our responsibility. So I think that's what Aquinas would argue. You make the choice. For good or bad, you make the choice, and you're in control of that choice. Now, that's a Thomistic perspective, and it would come out of my reading of both Thomas and philosophers like Eleanor Stumpf. Yes, Sherry.
I know you mentioned that you were a little bit tired of the Darwin debate.
Just a little bit.
But I wonder if you would mind, for our sake, to say something about how scientists see how it's a false contradiction that's been created between, I think you mentioned earlier, between the Darwin evolutionary point of view and the creationist alternative that's proposed in popular press and politics and elsewhere.
Sure, if you guys don't mind, I can do that. I'll try to do it quickly so we don't get too far off topic. Although it's related because a lot of the model of Darwin permeates the work on what it means to be human in the sense of the neurosciences. Everything is built, as you saw with Terry Deacon, on that evolutionary model. That's our central paradigm. Okay, so leading up to the work of Darwin, even Linnaeus, in his classification scene, thought that everything was created by God at the beginning in the form you see it today. So he actually worried about the fact that all horses didn't look exactly the same. And he wondered about, well, how is it that God created a horse and they don't all look alike? This one's brown and that one's white, and they're taller and shorter. So he came to the sort of Platonic conclusion that there was an ideal horse that God created, and all the others were just variations that developed. So, I mean, but he was very much a creationist in that meaning that we now give the word, that what it says in Genesis is how it happened. So was Darwin. But Darwin became a scientist, and a scientist observes the world. And Darwin started observing the world, right? Now, he was influenced. He was influenced by Lyell, the geologist, who had this view of geologic time. So the Bible, the world isn't just 10,000 years old, it's millions of years old. He had his own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, who had a sort of evolutionary model in mind in his work. He had the work of Thomas Malthus, the minister who wrote about limited resources and populations outstripping their resources and all that. These were his influences, right? So he comes back from the voyage, still convinced that God created everything in kind as we see it, but then developed this model, descent with modification from a common ancestor, looking at fossils, looking at everything he saw. All right, it's a model in the sense that I called models scientifically applicable descriptions of reality that we can test. So Darwin created a model, which we are still working and testing today, okay? And it's a viable model in that it has generated a huge amount of subsequent research, so it's fertile. So we've been able to not only look at the fossil record, but now molecular evidence of relatedness that is explained by this model, right? So it's a very fertile model, and it's yet to be falsified. Yes, there are challenges to the model. Right now it's under challenge from what's called horizontal gene transfer. It's also under challenge from epigenetics. Okay, but it's just teasing the model now. It's not saying the model's wrong. We all think the model's right. But it's science. It's a method of observation that produces a model of reality that we can test experimentally. Now, if I look at the model and say, gee, this model says Genesis is not correct, I don't need God. God's over. Genesis is incorrect. This is right. God's out. Toss the Bible out. We're done. Which was not Darwin's issue. It was Thomas Huxley's issue with his fight with the Church of England. Okay? So Huxley jumped on Darwin's model and said, finally, I can be, and he called himself an agnostic because it wasn't polite to call yourself an atheist in Victorian England. So he coined the word agnosticism, right? And said, I can be this now. So he then took what was science and made it into philosophy, okay? And that's been happening ever since on the side of people like Dawkins and Dennett and you name it, okay? There's nowhere in Darwin's method and conclusion which says, at this point you must stop believing in God. It never says that. In fact, in his original book, he took great pains to say, I'm not opposed to religion. In fact, he talks about a very famous divine, as he calls him in Britain, who was a minister that he had read the book, who was fine with it. And quite honestly, the Catholic Church in England is like, you know, hey, we had our time with Galileo. We're not getting into this. Okay, we went there, we lost, we're not doing this, okay? So the Catholic Church kind of backed out, and Leo the 13th, wrote an encyclical and said, you know, evolution's fine as a model, as a scientific enterprise. So it was really, the Church of England was fighting with Huxley. Translate that into America, and we had both creationists taking a look at this, as well as scientists in the early part, and there were lots of debates. But ultimately, in the beginning of the 20th century, and I hope I'm not making this too long, I'm trying to summarize a lot, we had the rise of what is called fundamentalism in this country. Now, fundamentalists are not anti-evolution. The fundamentalists were a movement in the Presbyterian Church that was against liberal Protestant movements in Europe. So they had a meeting and came up with the 5 fundamentals that you must believe to be a Christian. Not one of them had anything to do with evolution. In fact, one of the writers of the fundamentals, B.B. Warwick, was in fact a very big proponent of Darwinian evolution. He used it in theological references. So that led to this fundamentalist approach, which then devolved into a literal reading of the Bible approach, which then put the two sides, the Huxley side and the religious side, at loggerheads. But they are the extremes of the discussion. In the vast middle are people like myself, who call ourselves theistic evolutionists, who say evolution is the scientific description of how creation went. Got it. Okay, it's how it happened scientifically. I got no problem with that. And the Bible, Genesis, is a wonderful, beautiful story, an allegorical tale that I need to read and take to heart. But it's not a scientific text. Never was meant to be. And so that's where there's no conflict, in the middle, between these two very fundamentalist extremes. Is that? That's a long-winded, a little bit longer-winded, but that summarizes, like, what did we do last time? 6 hours. So. Yes, Bill.
Our message to the universe. You left over the question mark. Can you answer it? What's your answer?
Is that our message to the universe? Well, it certainly was for Carl Sagan and Frank Drake and others. I think, in some sense, if I interpret it theologically, it is. It is, if an alien intelligence encountered that, I think I'd be comfortable with them coming here to find us and say, you know, we like you guys from what we read and listened to, because we embedded some music in that too. So I don't remember the music that we sent. But I mean, if they came, they'd say, well, we like you. We think we can hang with you. I think that would say who we are, pretty much. Yes?
Just one thing about multiple incarnations.
Yeah.
I've avoided the question because I think it's just too hypothetical. But my kids ask me about it. You know, what would be a Christian's response? And you didn't go very much into what theologians actually say, so I mean, I don't really know what to tell my kids.
Well, I would almost encourage you to look at Ted's paper, because he kind of gives you the range of theological opinions, and they're all over the place. I mean, some say, you know, no, Christ died for all of creation, which is Paul's take. Paul's saying creation, given that he only thought it was the Greek concept of the cosmos at the time. But if you translate that into modern terms, that Christ died once for all creation. That would be one theological interpretation, all the way to others that say, no, no, Christ, the Son of God, probably had to come to all of these people and save them. And they're all over the place. And Ted doesn't come to any conclusion other than that they're all over the place. I mean, Ted doesn't express his own opinion, which I know is more like the first one. From talking to him, but he doesn't express it in the paper. And so that isn't as satisfying in there. And since it's such a very specific Christian topic with so many different answers, I kind of didn't want to go there in terms of what it means to be human, because it is a very specific, did everyone need the incarnation? In everyone in the universe, on any planet. And right now, with all the exoplanets we're discovering, who knows how many intelligences there are out there. I mean, I'm a believer in that prospect that we will meet ETI at one point. Maybe not in my lifetime, but at some time. I can't believe we're alone. This doesn't make sense for me. So, but I don't know the answer about the incarnation. Ted doesn't either, and none of the theologians he talked to have a really cogent statement to take home. Okay? We've exhausted everything? Now. Red.
Kind of a comment
Red.
question.
Maybe final word, Casey? Is that okay?
I was sitting in a meeting on the B-1 bomber back many years ago, and there was this German mechanical engineer, and he was explaining the structures and everything. There was an Air Force general that stood up and asked a question. And he very quickly said, well, that's far too complex for you to understand, and went on with his presentation. Which I always thought was a fantastic answer.
It is.
But when you're talking about the soul here in your presentation, I kind of felt like that general, and, you know, maybe it's far too complex for me to understand.
Well, I hope I didn't make it seem that way. I was certainly trying to open it up to you as best as I understand it, but I know exactly how the general feels. I was walking with a quantum mechanics guy one time, and he asked me what I do, and I told him everything about sequencing DNA and viruses and everything. And I said, and what do you do? He said, you wouldn't understand. And I said, no, seriously, what do you do? He said, no, seriously, you wouldn't understand. And that was the end of the discussion. He refused to go any further. That made me feel about that big. So I hope I didn't do that to you guys today.
No, I took from that conversation that the soul is the form, which is what you presented. And it kind of leads into my own philosophy, which was that if you believe there's more than the sum of your parts, you believe there's a soul. If you believe you're only the sum of your parts, then you don't believe in the soul.
And I like that. I really like that, because that goes right along with this move I'm making to sort of looking at biological networks and their emergent properties as equivalent to formal cause that Thomas was using. So if you think they're emergent properties and you're more than the sum of your parts, then you have a soul, in some sense. Yeah. Okay. Thank you guys for the day. It was absolutely great for me. Thank you.